First, I want to thank you, everybody, for coming on a beautiful Saturday morning in fall to listen to me, of all things, on strategic business execution. But strategic business execution is a topic that's very close, at least in my heart. The reason being is I've been working for 20 some odd years, and I've been teaching about 13 years. And as a consultant working for Fortune 500 companies, as well as a lot of other smaller companies, some of them nonprofits, some of them are actually quite well known, College Board, Consumer Reports, Lumina. They may not be Fortune 500, but how many people here taking SAT? Right? Probably practically everybody. And what I've found is through both the practice side of consulting, working in business, and the theory side of management strategy, is that there is a gaping hole, which I call business execution. So today's presentation is an overview. I've been looking at this topic for close to 10 years, and what I've put together are my ideas into one presentation, hopefully in 60 minutes with plenty of time for people to ask questions. We passed out some note cards, and if you have questions later, feel free to take on the cards and just send it in, or just throw your hands up and ask the questions. This session is being recorded because I like to post it on YouTube to talk about strategic business execution. So if any of you don't really want to be recorded, write your question, I'll just say it for you. Okay? Having said that, thank you again for coming, and let's get started. Today, what we'll cover is what is business execution? Why is it important in the business world today? How should we frame the question of business execution? It's a very, very broad topic. You talk to 100 executives, chances are 100 executives know what business execution. But if you ask people to start defining it, you probably get 100 different definitions. So I'd like to put some framework around that so we could look at it in a uniform way. And then my company, I actually recently left corporate world, as some of you know, started my own consulting company, and we consult with a lot of our clients. What we assemble is essentially 5 rules that we think is universally applicable to almost all situations, and with a little tweak, it actually even applies to you personally as well. So that's one of the last piece of today's conversation. So, prologue. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. How many people agree or disagree with that? I had the idea of forming on my own company a very long time ago, and it was great. It was a back of napkin, talking to friends, and then trying to get this company launched was really, really hard. And that is true in business world as well. So my interpretation is having a great idea is important. So this lecture, this whole presentation on business execution, isn't to say that strategy is not important. It is only to say that having a good strategy is only the beginning. It is not sufficient. So 2 more questions, by show of hands. How many of you have a lot of ideas, but not enough time to do something about them? Just show of hands. Wow. That's good. That means a couple things. 1, you are very smart. Congratulations. 2, you don't have enough time, right? And 3, you're probably not very realistic either, because if you have really realistic goals, you try to have fewer ideas. Of course, in my case, I keep on having new ideas, and I even have a folder on my laptop called Special Topics. I just write down new ideas. So it's always a rat chase. How many of you work for organizations that have the similar problems? In other words, long on strategy, but short on execution. I used to work for a lot of organizations doing strategies, and we come up with beautiful binders, beautiful plans, and everything is written perfectly. Except the minute it goes into execution, if it ever made to execution in the first place, the whole plan just blew up. And I think that's a lot of people's experience as well. So why is execution more difficult? And that's some of the questions that we've been asking. I think reason number 1, execution is difficult because it is messy. If you think about planning, in the plan you could lay out all the strategies. You could come up with beautiful framework. You could come up with processes, governance model, how things ought to happen. And of course, the reality is that no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And almost no project truly remains static the first time it hits a major issue, a risk, a change, a problem that requires some kind of deviation. Execution is messy because the team member you expect to show up on Monday morning decided to have an extra long weekend, or somebody happened to be sick. The vendor that you count on to deliver that service, even though they promised 99%, let's say, uptime, that 1% happened to be the minute you needed the most. Right? All these things happen. So that's one reason. Second reason I think is execution as a topic is very big, and it's also very vague. So in some sense, my contribution here is to try to put a better framework around the whole execution piece. And then the third reason, and this is now speaking both as a student, as a teacher, as a practitioner, is execution is just simply not sexy. You know, show of hands, how many people went to business school? A lot of my students, former and ex-students here, went to business school, want to be a grunt worker. Right? How many people want to sit back, have a beautiful hat on, nice title, hopefully something like C or VP or director. All I have to do is planning. I'll come up with the perfect plan. I'll let somebody else do the messy part called execution. It doesn't happen. I have friends that are really pretty high-level corporate strategists. And even for them, the genius part of 1% inspiration, they may spend 5% inspiration, still 95% on the perspiration side. And the reality is for most of us, and practically every one of us, spend overwhelming amount of time in trying to figure out how to do something, actually getting it done, than just why we're doing it. So execution is simply not sexy, I think, is because most students didn't go to MBA school saying, you know, I want to be a grunt worker, I want to be that worker bee, I want to labor through that task and face all the trouble. Strategy is beautiful. You know, you look at the various models out there. Michael Porter, if he's up here, could tell you about the 5 force models. It's just simply elegant. And that actually has a darker side to it. The darker side is what I consider to be on the research side. It's easier to research on things that you can control and contain and define. It is very hard to do research on a topic that's big, nebulous, and vague. So if you look at, I did some quick search, Amazon, my favorite bookstore, right? And I did a quick search on Amazon, typed the word execution, implementation, couple related terms, and I get about 2,000 hits. Not too bad. I was feeling pretty good. But take a guess when I type in strategy or strategic, how many hits I get? 42,000 hits. It's roughly 19 to 20 times more on how to do things. And that is the discrepancy you see both from the academic side, from the, let's say, the business leaders, the practical thinkers. Harvard Business Review, I think, has only 3 articles I could think of that's really hands-on execution, and God knows how many articles on planning or ideation or strategic planning or strategy. And so it creates that often perception that execution equals grunt work. And I'm here to confirm that it is actually quite a bit grunt work. But it is an essential component in what makes business work. Because after all, what is a strategy without showing results? What is a strategy without execution? Because if that's the case, what you have is just beautiful binders on the bookshelf collecting dust. So, some of the questions, right? How many companies have beautiful and expensive binders of idea strategies? How many of them are well executed? I speak for a lot of years of experience because I actually do write some of that strategy earlier in my career, and I still do to this very day. But the primary difference that when I do it today versus, let's say, 10 years ago, is I become quite a fierce realist asking the question, can we achieve results? How can we make these ideas into actions? How to make actions into initiatives and projects? How do we execute against them? Because otherwise, the world-class ideas are just ideas. The other side is, and I run a consulting company, so I have a bias here. I have a bias toward action. I found that there's a lot of good advice out there, but be blunt, advice are cheap. Unless you have to actually get into the weed, roll up your sleeve, get things done. Advice are just simply beautiful, elegant, it's almost always right. You don't have to execute on it, you don't have to do it. So as a company, what we do is we help our clients come up with ideas, and we also help them execute on those ideas. I think that is the responsible thing to do. So I won't name some of the big names players out there. There are a lot of strategy consulting firms. And recently I actually worked with a client which hired one of those companies. And since I plan to post this on YouTube, I won't name the name of the company. And it was unanimous after the strategy session was done. They were thinking, should we use that company for further work? And the company, they did sort of a quick vote around the company and was unanimous to let go of the company. One, they were expensive. Two, they came up with advice that were great, except they are not executable. And there's just a divorce from reality. So the value of a plan without execution, without making it actionable, is really very little. And if you think about it, this applies to you personally as well. It applies to all of us in a personal way. You know, ever since I was a kid, I want to be rich. I want to be CEO. That was my original plan. And of course, none of my action lead me to that point really, up until the point that I decided to run my own company. Why? Because my personality is not aggressive enough. That is my fault, I realize that. I probably should be a little more assertive. I could be hard-nosed. And even with my last job, I had to let go a bunch of people because of outsourcing. I decided to switch up so I could avoid the pain of letting go my department. It's just not me. And that's where I have a beautiful plan I can execute. So now I'm on my plan B, running my own company. So at least I could claim to be a CEO of the company. Some astonishing findings from research that you see out there. And this is done by Kaplan and Norton in their book. 90% of well-formulated strategy fail due to poor execution. Well, that's an astonishing number. Actually, personally, if I had to guess, I wouldn't guess 90%, but that is what the research shows. 5% of employees understand their firm's corporate strategy. So the flip side of it is you may have questions, T, what is good execution? The flip side of that is, does your employee understand your corporate strategy? 3% of executives think their company is very successful at executing strategy, only 3%. While 62%, they're only moderately successful or worse. And then in 2009, this is a darker number, and this is, I looked at the Department of Small Business Administration, the federal side. In 2009, which is 2 years after recession, so granted as a bad year, in this country we have 523,000 new businesses started. Sounds a lot, 500,000 new business. And that's why small business really forms the foundation of our economy. But how many closed down? 661,000. Astonishingly high number. And by the way, the number of annually that opens and closes is roughly equal. So it's just how many businesses fail due to poor execution, usually not necessarily due to poor ideas. So I started looking at this topic of business execution, partly because I actually want to teach a class in here. I think we are offering MGMT for $492 next semester in the spring. And as a part of my own research, I want to see what textbook do I ask the students to use. So I actually bought half.com, great place to buy textbooks, and read through most of the books on execution. I came up with about a dozen books. And for those of you who are further interested in this topic, all of these are excellent books. So take, for example, Execution. This is written by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan, which is a fairly high-powered concern. Larry Bossidy was a CEO of Honeywell. And in that book, this book is in some ways sort of the modern forerunner of the execution movement. It is the first book published around 2001, and it has a pretty big following. In the book, it talked about aligning strategies with execution, aligning the people process, the operational process, and strategic processes. It's an excellent book as a starter read. They later wrote another book I actually thought was really interesting. I just finished reading that book. And by the way, if I say I ever read a book, it means I listen to a book. I almost never read a book. I listen to audio tape. So I listen to Confronting Reality. And I thought that book has a lot of great anecdotes of how and why companies fail if they do not confront the reality of their situation, both internal and external. Meaning if the competitors in the field change their business model, made it significantly more efficient, essentially changing the rule of the game. Unless you deal with that in an effective way, your company is going to go the way of the dinosaurs. And there are other excellent books out here. Most recently, I read Stephen Covey's The 4 Disciplines of Execution. I shouldn't say read. That book only came out on audio tape. There is no reading version of that. There is no text version of that I found. So it's only on audio. And it's a short audio. It's not very long, a couple of hours. It's, again, excellent book that talked about the 4 disciplines of execution. So I encourage you, all of you, if you're interested, I love this title of this book, Get It Done. So let's talk about the importance of strategic business execution. I have to read this. I can't remember this. A thought which does not result in an action is not much, and an action which does not proceed from a thought is nothing at all. And that goes back to my original premise. This whole presentation isn't about strategy is bad. It is just saying that having a good strategy is just a starting point. And so my understanding is plan without action is worth very little. Organizations need to have a solid plan. I'm a project manager, for example, and in project management, we spend disproportionate amount of time on planning, or at least we ought to. We don't often do that because of various conditions and constraints, but we ought to. But even the best plan often doesn't survive the first change request from the client or the first big problems that come up. You need to have a system and process to deal with those changes and problems. Take a small step back. And a small step back is saying, so, okay, now we talked about execution, business execution, why it's important, why it doesn't work well out there. How does it apply to companies? That's a very small framework that I use in our consulting world. When we work with our clients, we look at companies and we distill it down to 3 simple components that applies to all organizations that want to have a future. So I guess you could have a failed company and dysfunctional company that these 3 doesn't apply. But in practicality, for a company to continue operating, they have to do some level of planning. They have to do some level of operating and some level of changing. And as you can see, changes in our world today is far faster than it used to be due to globalization, technology changes. A lot of companies started shutting down their tablets once the iPad came out. Why? Because they realized iPad is better. But fast forward a little bit now, Samsung is coming up with new pads, tablets, new phones, so much faster than Apple. And Apple still has an annual cycle. Now, there's no loser and winner yet. Actually, there are some losers and winners, but it's hard to tell the ultimate future. But you could see that dynamic is shifting. And if you look far enough back, after World War II, for example, the rest of the world is pretty much devastated by the different wars. America's the only country standing, and we don't have to do much to compete. Henry Ford said you could have any color car you want as long as it is black. But what happened in the 60s and the 70s? The rest of the world started rebuilding. By 80s, they're catching up. By 90s, we had the fear here of Japanese taking over vast markets from electronics to cars. And what that gives rise to is companies now have to change faster. They have to change better. And by the way, it's great for project management, the course I teach. Some of my students are here, right? Because when you're talking about change, major initiatives, now you're talking about projects, programs, initiatives, transformations. And that's why PMI membership went from, I don't know, let's say when I became PMP, Project Management Professional, in 2002, I think there were about 7,000 members. Right now, the latest number I saw is 550,000 PMPs worldwide. When I became PMP, it was definitely a competitive advantage in the marketplace, selling myself as a professional project manager. Today, it's barely competitive parity, because if you don't have it, it's a disadvantage. The number, by the way, is so skewed that the PMI membership, the entire PMI membership, is less than 500,000 people, and yet the number of PMPs is 550,000. So you could see that. Once you started thinking about the organization, this framework, the planning, operating, and changing, how much is it execution related? My opinion is it's nearly everything. Why is it nearly everything? Because even when you look at planning side, which you could argue that you don't have to do very much when you do planning, that's no longer true. Unless you plan for execution, unless you plan in the sense of that reality of what my company is able to do, what are the external factors in which we need to react. Plan, it just becomes another binder sitting on the bookshelf. So even planning have to be thinking about execution. Obviously, changing is almost all execution, and even operating. This framework that we have here is what my company used to look at organization, especially on large-scale change, transformational type project, enterprise resource planning, because it touches upon almost every single fabric of that organization. And to get that work done requires a multidisciplinary approach. It is no longer sufficient to worry just about IT, business process. You have to start thinking about what does it mean for people, what does it mean for the business processes, for the stakeholders, both internal to the organization and outside. So that's just a quick preview of what my company does. Having said that, we're not really going to dive into the detail of this framework. So what is the benefit of thinking strategically about business execution? Frankly, it comes down to a really simple one. Things just get done. They may not be perfect. Often you have to make trade-off decisions. And that is the nature of execution because they are going to be unexpected. But typically the alternative of not doing things, not focusing on the right metrics, not focusing on the most essential components of what make that organization work, is going to be far worse. Maybe Apple, given the pressure from Samsung and everything, may come up with a product, faster product cycle. It may be more buggy. I know a lot of people complaining about the latest iPhone iOS or iPad iOS 7, right? But imagine if it come out later, let's say half a year later. I think for Apple, the consequence may be far worse. So what does the research show? And this is a question that was asked by a consulting company to about 138 performance managers. And essentially, does your organization have a formal strategy execution process in place? And the good news is actually not vast majority, but small majority does say yes. So about 54% of those companies and the rest 46 says no. If you look at the result of the execution though, the percentage of companies who achieve breakthrough results perform better than their peer groups in their industry. You can see the ones that have a strategic execution planning process in place achieve astonishingly higher and better results than the ones doesn't. And that number to me is really, really telling. However, a criticism of that number is it is a relatively small sample. 138 performance managers is not a large-scale study. But there aren't that many large-scale studies in this area. This is one of my favorite, for those of you who know me, like Bob from the day of Stevens, who remember I actually have a philosophy degree. So that's why you see me quoting a lot of quotes. Aristotle said, "Excellence is never an accident. It's always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, skillful execution, and the ability to see obstacles as opportunities." I love that phrase. I just want to replace one word. So my interpretation, execution is never an accident. So I actually originally didn't replace my picture there, but I didn't want to look that old. So I figured my picture does a little more justice here. So now gets to the boring part, the detail of what is strategic business execution. The way we look at it is strategic business execution is an interdisciplinary practice of aligning strategic business objectives with implementation. It is a practice because it requires a pragmatic application of this body of interdisciplinary skills and finding the right behaviors and attitudes. The interdisciplinary refers to simultaneous application of many different schools of thoughts. And this is where the messiness comes in. This is where the broadness of it comes in. Because there's strategic planning, there's organization change management, there's communication. In project world, we love the triple P, portfolio, program, and project management. And of course, there's innovation, there's technology. Aligning refers to the continuous adjustment, that ensuring that actions and planning are in agreement and are in tandem. That's extremely important. Larry Bossidy, in his book, Before I Mention Execution, made a very, very big deal about having robust conversation in an organization between the planners and the doers. And by the way, in his view, there are no planners, there are no doers. Everybody's a planner and doer. That alignment needs to be there. And then, of course, implementation refers to the methodical execution of the business objectives to achieve real and tangible benefits. By the way, I should say, if you have questions, just jump in and ask. Otherwise, I just keep on going. And for those of you who know me, I could just keep on talking too. Okay? So the strategic business drivers refers to establishment, prioritization, and resourcing of critical business and organizational goals, both short-term and long-term, and they're essential for survival and growth. Right? These are the strategic business drivers. A question you may almost immediately want to ask for the company that you work for, what are these strategic drivers and objectives? So in short, strategic business execution is about doing the right thing the right way. The right thing is the strategy. The right way is everything else, the messy part. Project management, program management, product development, organization change, process improvement, business transformation. The list just goes on. These are all various toolkits that we bring. A good practitioner typically are familiar with very good in few, familiar with a couple of others, because you know, being a resourceful practitioner, someday you may need that. And doing the right way is hard. It is very, very difficult, and that's what makes execution messy. So, a framework that we look at, strategic business execution, is that there are 4 components that need to work in tandem. The first one starts at both the individual level as well as going to the organizational level. And that is the basic value, behavior, and attitude. What do I mean by that? We look at these as intrinsic software that programs an individual, an organization, a team, sometimes a country. Right? What are the intrinsic value that you believe in? And those software guides your behavior. Your attitude, a manifestation of your attitude is in your behavior. So that's the first component. The second is, what are the important competencies? And competency here referring to essential skills and expertise that's required for business execution. The third component, core discipline. These are basic methods, approaches, systems that controls the work that you do. And then the last is what we call integrating processes. I like to use the word, it's the glue that ties everything together, except my company, somebody told me, glue sounds a little bit too rigid here because you have to unglue it to change. So we use the word unifying. It's the unifying force that ties all these components together. And what you see out here is so far what I consider to be our unique contribution to the field of strategic business execution. Of all the books that I read before, most of the book touch one or more of those components, but not all four. So this is what I like to explain a little bit more. So if you combine these, you essentially, I think, achieves or has a better chance of achieving execution excellence. So if you look at the values, behaviors, and attitude, right? These are the intrinsic software, as I call it, that operates at all levels, whether you're individual, a team, because a team has its own dynamic, a division, or a company. A company has its own culture. Here are some of the examples of what I consider to be execution-oriented value behaviors and attitude. I don't claim this list to be comprehensive, because there could be many, many more. I love Ben Franklin, for those of you who know me, right? He has 13 virtues. I took 2 of them. I stole 2 of his. One is being industry. The sheer fact that you work and you work hard has a value. And resolution, to adhere to what you do in a disciplined way. And the last I thought is integrity, but again, this is just some feelers out there. The behaviors. Behaviors are by definition things you could observe. These are physical manifestation of your beliefs, of your attitude. And that's the couple that I think is extremely important are respectful, teamwork, organizing, and then attitude. Attitude, can-do attitude. That's extremely important in an execution-oriented culture. Because if you believe the problem is greater than the solution, everybody throw up their hands and go home. Optimism, a resiliency, because failure is almost inevitable. It was funny, the other day I was just at my daughter's school meeting with the teacher and meeting with a math teacher, and I was asking the math teacher to make sure my daughter fails, in a nicer way, but fails relatively early. Why? Because that builds resiliency. And I think one of the general problems with our society is as a whole, we like to pat each other on the back a little too much. But that's a separate problem. Next, I looked at competencies. Okay? There are many, many competencies. One of the best frameworks that I reviewed is by a company, actually by a researcher. His name is Lominger. He wrote a book called The Career Architect, and in there he identified 67 competencies. We added a couple more, 2 more, to make it 69. And the top 10 competencies, again, these competencies are mostly at the individual level, but you could extrapolate them and make it team as well as company level, are being action-oriented. The ability to balance. Execution, at the end of the day, is very much of a balancing act. How many people here ever complain on a project that have too many resources, too much money, and too much time? It's typically, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough people, I don't have enough skill set, the time is impossible, how can anybody get anything done? So you're constantly balancing, if I do a little here, do a little there, maybe I could get this project done, right? Conflict management. There are 3 types of conflicts that we look at typically. There's the process conflict, people who genuinely didn't agree on how to do things. And their relationship conflict, people who just hate each other. And the fact that I have a lot of old friends here means they at least didn't hate me very much. And then there's task conflict. Task conflict or prioritization conflict. For example, if you have a multi-cross business unit type project, you have finance, marketing, let's say manufacturing, well, they have slightly different priorities, right? Putting them together, working on a common project, inevitably will have task conflict. Any organization undertaking ERP, enterprise resource planning, will have these conflicts. It's just inherent in the nature of the people that you bring to work. But how do you resolve these conflicts? Because if you don't, it could spiral out of control and goes into a vicious cycle. Decision making. Decision making can be fast, can be slow, but is it effective? The key component about decision making is once a decision is made, is it adhered to? Because in a lot of organizations, the minute decision is made, next thing you know, people are backtracking left and right, or repositioning, or coming back for a second visit, or a third visit. Our US government just happened to have the wonderful experience of going through that recently, as I'm sure of you know. Delegation. Especially leaders in business execution have to delegate, just one human. Even if you work 24 hours a day, that's 24 hours a day, you don't get 25 hours. So delegation is an important skill. Interpersonal savviness. You have to work with people. People want to work with you. Otherwise, the conflict on the relationship side just goes way high. Managerial courage. Especially leaders in business execution will have to make tough decisions. It's just unavoidable. And when you have a team who has very strong voice one, very strong voice two, what happens? Sometimes the leader has to sit back and say, you know what, we're going to do this. In what I found, the difference between non-profit organization and the for-profit organization, though, this actually varies quite a bit. In the for-profit organization, typically there's a greater central command, a chief, a VP who can make that decision. So generally speaking, this is now 2013, people tend to be more participative. So yes, we get all the ideas and etc. But somebody's willing to make that decision. In a nonprofit organization, I found there isn't that person who's able to make that kind of tough decision without overwhelming support from their peers and the various constituents. So in nonprofit organization, what happens is that you have to do surveys, studies, organization change, prioritization models, get everybody's buy-in, input, and finally come up with a decision which may not be perfect, but that the organization can live with. So the time it takes to make a decision in this case, for example, in managerial courage is in for-profit organization, it requires a little bit less of managerial courage because you use the process to dictate the outcome. By the way, the benefit of that typically is in the execution phase, people are genuinely more bought into the process. And that does actually expedite the execution. So they do catch up in some cases. Motivating other people, again, I think important training leaders. And then the last piece, problem solving. When I go on business interviews or meeting with clients, people ask me what I do, and sometimes I just say I solve problems. The ability to diagnose, to analyze, to articulate, to read back, to come up with recommendations, and then help them not only make the recommendations, but to implement the recommendations, is being execution-oriented. So these are sort of the top 10, what we believe are the important competencies. And then there are the integrating processes. These are the basic processes. Question?
I had a question. You talked about the top 10, which I agree with you, but maybe if you could speak to, because I think depending on the team that you're on, each team has a different personality, depending on the business that you're part of, they have a different culture, small, medium, large, global, local. What do you think from that 10 that you have, which they're all very important, what are the most critical to certain cultures or certain personalities?
That's a great question. As a good consultant would say, it depends, right? Practically everything depends on the context. If you work in an organization that is very, very hierarchical, decision tends to be top-down. It is generally easier to get to the point in which execution ready. A lot of these factors do still come into play. Right? Being able to be very action-oriented, for example, when the organization can make that rapid decision is probably more important than, let's say, my description of a nonprofit organization. Being action-oriented can be a hindrance. People could see you're just too gung-ho. Right? We need the process to legitimize the action that needs to be taken. So it depends on the organization. My last company, again, name was held. When we implemented the ERP system, it took somewhere around 5 years to get enough momentum and support from the top leadership team before breaking the ground on that execution. So in those organizations, interpersonal skills, somewhere here, and maybe I should put politics up here, becomes extremely important. I once actually spoke to a friend who called me for just career advice, and we were just chatting. And I really didn't know her very well. It's a friend of a friend. And she told me that in her career, I don't know, let's say 15 years of career, she launched something around 15 different products. It's really quite an impressive number. I'm sitting here thinking, in my 20 years experience, I launched, I think, 4 things. So, but I don't necessarily think my 4 things is less than that 15. It's just that it's in a very different organization setting. My previous organization is a very large company with offices in about 150 countries. So one initiative there actually was just rolling out a database is measuring years. While in a smaller startup, of course, they'll go through 5 projects and products in less than 6 months. So there is no easy answer to your question. Now, in the appendix later, you'll see I'll list all 69 competencies. So you could figure out which one's the best. Any other questions? Okay. So integrating processes. These are the unifying processes. And by the way, most organizations have some level of these processes. Nothing I'm saying here I think is going to be an aha moment. Oh, I never thought about that, or I've never seen that before in an organization. It's how these work together. So integrating processes, in my mind, is trying to find the right balance between system and flexibility in the organization. And what these processes are enable you to do, and I think it's a key word, is make the complex decisions and processes into some kind of routine. The better the organization can drive complexity into clarifying routines, the faster the organization is able to respond, react, or execute. Some of the processes that we look at and we consider to be our specialty in terms of helping our clients, and these are the top 8, governance, planning, organizing, issue risk management, conflict management, change management, information knowledge management, dependency management, and business alignment. These are things that we do every day. So the last piece is, of course, the 10 core disciplines. And I like this, George Washington. Discipline is the soul of the army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak and esteem to all. And my interpretation is to achieve execution excellence, business must apply the right discipline to the problem at hand. And there are many disciplines. When we start looking at this, we found 9 disciplines. There could be more. We're not saying this is the world of all the disciplines, but we believe these 9 to be the most relevant and important to business execution. We start with strategic planning. Again, strategy is important. Having the right plan that is both flexible and commands the right direction is paramount to execution success. Because after all, if you don't do the right thing but do it the right way, you're not still achieving success. Beyond that, you start looking at portfolio management. And this is what we advocate to clients that's undertaking a lot of initiatives. Why? Because you need to look at it from a various multidimensional way, both financial, perhaps strategic, and essentially analyze it just like you analyze your own financial portfolio. A lot of people have their financial portfolio, and you know what the buzzwords typically around that is diversification. Don't put everything in the same bucket. Well, that's portfolio management. Program management, managing large-scale change effort, building the new capability of an organization. Project management, a course that we teach here. how to get things done, how to make the deliverable, create that deliverable, build that deliverable on time, within the scope, on budget. Hopefully nobody's too mad at you because they didn't work that hard and burn out. PMO. My company specializes in PMO, and we'll come back to that point. I believe PMO is critical to sustain success because it is that engine that keeps on rolling that makes sure the organization do the right thing. Operational management. How to keep the lights on is extremely important. Then, of course, there's process improvement, there's organization change management, and one of our specialties, Kumar actually here is our visual specialist. He's a guru. And I think some of you probably, other students may have heard him speak in class about data visualization and using data visualization to support decision making. So very quickly what they are, and I'm going to go through this a little quicker because it gets a little dry. Strategic planning. For organization to be successful, the strategy, having a strategic plan that works is essential. Because not only do strategy provide direction, it also aligns the entire organization toward achieving the plans. So our advocacy for strategic planning as we work with our clients on what we call executable strategic plan, collaborative. We have to bring people together. Strategic planning should not be done by one department and try to exert to everybody else, because it doesn't really work that way. It needs to be data-driven. It cannot be, it could have some emotion, but it can't be purely emotional-driven. And this is usually tougher working with companies who has a very strong C-level executives, or the founder is still the executive. Now that's probably one of the worst things, because a lot of decision will be emotionally driven versus data-driven. Be realistic. Can the organization actually achieve its goals? Does it have the capability to take on this new set of initiatives? And then prioritize. But in prioritization, and later our 5 rules will show, not only important to figure out what is the most essential, but also make a decision what else can just be good enough. Because good enough gives you the buffer, the extra resource to work on the most essential. Because the answer is everything got to be perfect. On a large-scale initiative, that's really, really tough to do. Portfolio planning or management. So we talked about portfolio management. By the way, Project Management Institute have a standard around portfolio management. And for those of you that are students, it's great that if you want to join PMI, you could download it for free. They give you that standard for free. And portfolio management is essentially looking at the initiatives that organization takes as investment. And by the way, I do believe all projects are investments. The fact that you are putting a body of resource together to get something one time done is investment. If not investment in external money, out-of-pocket money, it is still investment in resources. So the key processes in portfolio management are identifying, categorizing, evaluating, prioritizing, authorizing opportunities. It is about identifying risk, analyzing them, come up with risk response. It is about balancing and rebalancing the portfolio when changes happen, when projects are done, when new ideas come in. It's about communicating, monitoring, controlling, reviewing the performance of the portfolio on a regular basis so you could constantly refresh that, and then make adjustments if the business strategy changes. The third piece, program management. How many people work on programs before? I know a lot of you work on projects. Oh, excellent. Right? In PMI's world, the difference between projects and program is program focused on benefits, while project focused on deliverables. And when we mean by benefits, PMI's latest, the 3rd edition of the program management standard, they actually come up with a new term. They call it performance domains, the first time they started using this word. And they group essentially their own knowledge areas into these performance domains. And that's strategy alignment, governance, life cycle management, benefit management, and stakeholder management. So portfolio is looking after very big change. Now I had the fortune in my experience to work on at least 2 very large scale programs. One was helping a financial service company to build a whole new loan servicing That was big, building a loan servicing. And the second is in the enterprise resource planning area, implementing SAP. Project management. The latest PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge 5.0, that just came out in April of this year, contains 10 knowledge areas. And that is scope, schedule, budget, procurement, risk, quality, human resources, stakeholder communication, and integration. I tend to know PMBOK or project management stuff really well because I'm also the director of corporate outreach in the New York chapter. So we talk about this all the time. But these knowledge areas are quite important for project managers and something we talked about in class. And by the way, the latest one that the PMI added is the stakeholder. Originally, in the 4th edition, the 3rd edition is only 9 knowledge area. They added the 10th one. Project Management Office. Now, that's a vast topic. And later, when we're done, if anybody interested, this is my company's big business card. You know, the small business card versus the big card. In back, we have a framework, our framework around Project Management Office. We essentially break Project Management Office into 3 groups. We call it the essential components. And these are the core processes required for the tactical management and control of the projects in a fairly project-intense environment. Then our second areas are the advanced PMO functionalities. And these are shifting toward using greater intelligence, analytics, and toward longer-term value, looking project more as investments over time. And then finally is the strategic side of the PMO. It becomes value-driven, creating value for the organization in a long-term fashion with deeper alignments throughout processes. And there are many, many capabilities in a PMO. When we started mapping this out, we came up, I think this shows about 25. I'm sure if we sit back and think about it more, there could be more than this. Operational management. Operational management is, at the end of the day, about keeping the lights on. It is the services that you provide or the organization provides to itself to make sure it maintains its operational efficiency and being very effective at what it does. One of the best framework out there, for those of you interested, that came from IT. It's the ITEL framework. Information Technology, what is it for? Information Technology Library. Infrastructure Library, thank you very much. Infrastructure Library. And by the way, it's not only used for IT anymore. CERN, for example, the European body for the atomic study, recently applied ITEL to manage its buildings. So it is about service strategy. What kind of service do we want to provide to our stakeholders? It is about design. How do we design the most efficient processes that balances the decision-making, the effectiveness side of it, and making it work? The transition. If we design something, how do we make the organization adopt it? What is that transition strategy? Things just doesn't magically happen. The fact that you design it may not work. Operation. Now put it into practice. And then, of course, final piece is continuous improvement. ITEL, again, is a widely popular framework out there. And I think the latest version is 3.0 ITEL. Process improvement. Organizations functions through its processes. That's true for all organizations. And when we work with our clients, when we work with our constituents on processes, we look at 4 categories of processes. Management process, used for planning, decision support, governance. Operational process, managing the core of the business. Changing process for program project management. I recently actually gave a presentation to the Asset Management Society on on change management, not organization change management. Supporting processes, that's enable all the other processes to work and functions in an organization. Number 8, organization change management. Organization change management deals with the topic of how do we make people, teams, and the organization work toward the common goals and manage the change through that effort. And from an organization change management perspective, there are the business processes, the organization restructure. We recently working with a client that's going through merger and acquisition, real merger and acquisition. They really want to make the acquisition work. They came up with 81 initiatives. And the funny thing is I started talking to the business owner of these initiatives. Half the initiatives they came up with are now on my list of 81. So I'm thinking the actual list of initiatives is probably close to 250 to 200. And the two organizations that's merging are not very big. So I'm actually thinking for every man, child, woman, and cats on their staff, at least they're working on one or more initiatives. But organization change management is about making the business processes understandable to the people. At the next level, you start looking at the organization, looking at the structure of those organizations, focusing on the change navigation, how to create a roadmap for people to move from where they are today to where they need to be in the future. A deeper level is culture. A culture is a word that comes up very, very often in organization change, especially in mergers and acquisition, because the idea of merging two organizations requires a third culture or adopt one of the other cultures. And then last is coming up with a shared vision. And then the last piece of the processes, disciplines, is data visualization and decision support. The way we look at it is visual communication is more powerful than words. And I'm trying to go through this a little quicker because we have a lot of words and not a lot of visual, but I want to get through the concept. The idea is how to connect with people between what they see and the message trying to come across. In our firm, and most things we do, we try to be very visually pleasing, but more importantly is convey information in a chunkable fashion in which people can understand. So visual interpretation of information in form of simple but powerful diagrams, in terms of tables, in terms of charts, makes it more meaningful for the recipients. So that's one of our last, what we believe to be important discipline of business execution. Okay? Let me pause here just to say we went through none of them pretty quickly because that was the most boring piece of the lecture, so I want to get to it. Any questions? Okay. So given what we talked about, the four major components, the values and the attitudes, the integrating processes, the core disciplines, and the important competencies, it could be a bit overwhelming. Right? For practical use, you're talking about many, many, many different factors, and it is still messy even though you put it into a proper framework. Also, business can't wait to figure everything else out before they need to do something. After all, usually business are already operational, they're quite happy and alive, they want to continue to make changes. So in augmentation to our overall framework for strategic business execution, we, of course, want to help our clients to be very hands-on. And so taking our experience working with clients, taking my academic and the research side of the interest, we came up with 5 rules in which we believe are pretty much universally applicable. And I love this quote from Victor Hugo. By the way, Les Miserables is coming to New York. I'm excited. And as a secret here, I actually bought the ticket for the next May, very good seat, to celebrate my anniversary, but my wife doesn't know it. And he said it. I think he said it very nice. She's not going to listen to this whole thing. I could assure you that. I love this quote. One cannot resist an idea whose time has come. I believe the focus on business execution is now. People has been, a lot of practitioners, executives have been asking for business execution for a very long time. And I like to think that I have given a lot of thoughts to this area and I have some contribution to make. So the 5 rules that we came up with are pretty simple. One is focus on the vital few. What are the very few things that the organization must do? That question can be applied at many, many different levels. Let's say you're doing a huge project, right? The question can be, what are the vital few objectives that the project must hit in order for it to be successful? And it has to be very, very vital. And by the way, individual, same thing. What are the things you need to do that you will consider yourself to be successful? Some people could be making a lot of money. Some people could be a lot of power and title. Other people could be having a lot of friends. Some people like a better work-life balance. But there are going to be a couple of vital few things that you know that if you don't hit it, you're not going to be as successful. So that's true at the individual level, team level, company level, and of course for us also at a nation level, country level. I think we just failed our first test though. So focus on the vital few. The second is what I love, and unfortunately I don't know how to go to market and sell the strategy. It's called determine what is good enough for the rest. What do I mean by that is, in order for the vital few to work, things doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a fairly complex web. There are going to be supporting components to those vital few. And to me, it is imperative that those supporting components has to be good enough. So for example, we may have the world's best car, but the highway is full of potholes. Right? You're still not going to achieve whatever speed you're trying to attain. So even though that car may be that vital few, we want a fast transportation system. We want a bullet train in this country. But our track are so integrated that the minute you go above 70 miles per hour, it probably overheats and melts the track. So those are the enabling. But what's good enough? Well, maybe we can't get to 300 miles per hour like we have in China or Europe. But 200 wouldn't be bad. So those enabling processes, organization must diligently look at and say, you know what, this is good enough. The third rule is establish good metrics and reward system. This is grounded in the principle of being an economist. Right? Economists believe all human beings are driven by incentives. And if your incentive is aligned with the strategic objectives, you're more likely to achieve that. The fourth is create an easy to understand scoreboard. What I mean by that is, especially with large initiatives that you align your entire organization around, it's often too complicated to communicate in a very complex scorecard. Balanced scorecards, for example, are great, but at the minute of having more than 5 or 6 different metrics, people start getting lost. If you want the entire organization to corral around the initiatives and support it, make it simple. Recently, I actually found a very good word, and I struggle with this a little bit because a lot of things we do in business are rather complicated. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen there are books out there on how to simplify complexity. But there are many ways to simplify complexity. And the dumbest way, of course, is just to be simple-minded about complexity. So recently, I actually found a very good word about dealing with complexity. It's not so much to simplify it, it is to clarify it. And use that clarification to distill it to a couple metrics, a scoreboard that everybody can understand. And then develop a culture of accountability. Why that is important? Don't let the small things slip. It is not okay to let the small things slip because the next thing you know, the next bigger thing got slipped. That's okay. And next thing you know, the whole initiative may slip. So if you look at these, focusing on the vital few. This is a Stephen Covey matrix. He looked at 2 dimensions. He said there's the urgency and there's the importance. Right? And if you plot it, you get a 2x2 matrix. Very simple. If you look at, the low urgency and low importance, the basic question is, why are they even on the list, guys? Let's just move it out so we don't have to deal with it. The next one is you look at our high on the importance scale, but low on the urgency. Now, if your organization is going through gut-wrenching change and everybody are genuinely busy, these may be important initiatives, but the right question to ask is, do we have to do them now? Because buying yourself time, breathing room, gives you the ability to focus on the things that's more urgent and more important. The other dimension, high on urgency side, but low on importance side. The logical question there is, why are we working on these now? They are not important. They may be urgent. What if we don't deal with it? Just let it happen. Well, that's a different story. But anyway, that you could save yourself a little trouble. The most important thing is work on the vital few. Both are important and urgent. So this is a very simple framework. You could apply to practically your life. You know, make a list, put it 2 dimensions. And by the way, if you do this for your personal life, I'd recommend there's a 3rd dimension called emotional attachment. I say that because my wife and I came up with beautiful matrix when we go house shopping, right? We never bought a house that's top on our list. Why? Because they're, for some reason, emotionally attached to something else, even though it has the most important features we wanted or the most urgent things that we wanted. So if you do that for personal life, I'd recommend adding the 3rd called emotional. Determine what's good enough. I think we all have the desires to achieve excellence, but the price of excellence can be very, very high. And sometimes unrealistically high. What do I mean by that? You know, take an analogy from information technology, hosting services, for example. If you host your services and you go purchase that, and you want an uptime of 95%, that's pretty low by industry standard actually today. It's relatively expensive. So let's say that has a unit cost of 1. The difference between 95% and 99% could be not just 1 time the cost, it could be 2, 3, 4 times the cost. And then of course the industry standard is moving towards 6 Sigma. So it's no longer 99%, it's 99.99999%. And once you start going up every additional 9 beyond that decimal point, the cost factor increase isn't 1 or 2 times. It's often in the magnitude of 10, 100. It's almost a logarithmic scale. And that is true for a lot of things that you do as well. What is simply good enough? Is an important question to ask. In most business endeavors, achieving good enough itself and aligning it across the system itself can be extremely valuable. You know, I used the analogy before of Apple iOS 7 came out and people say it's buggy, and it is buggy. My daughter's phone battery life went from all day, let's say 9 hours, down to almost 6 hours, and we still couldn't figure out why. Okay? But for Apple, they look at it and say, if I'm coming out later, let's say just by another 3 months, Samsung and my competitors, the Android market, will eat my lunch. I have to get it out. More importantly, for the entire system to work, right? Success, especially in large business initiatives, is built upon many, many pieces. There are the vital few that have to work well, but the rest is our supporting. And this is where the good enough comes in. Often they do not need to be perfect. And why is it also important? Because it does reduce anxiety. It reduces workload. In the merger acquisition case that I mentioned before was one of our clients, everybody I interviewed, their first thing is we have doing too many things. I interviewed one client on Columbus Day past Monday. On Monday, he already looked like he'd been there for 80 years. You know, he's just unkempt, hairs. And this is Monday at I think 11 o'clock. And I looked at him thinking, oh God, what a weekend. So buying time, giving yourself more resources, giving your organization more breathing room is important. Establishing good metrics and reward system. Business and people often achieve what they measure. Our class just went through a couple of presentations, and some of the students work on the project of attaining their MBAs as a project. And they measure it by the grades, by the time, by the financial. And guess what? Chances are they're going to make all those, because you do get what you measure. In organization, aligning the reward system to those goals are critical. What you often see in organization is that there is such a disconnect that you often don't know why the reward is there. In my experience working in corporate America, for example, my last years I worked for a larger organization, one of my best years delivered the best product and solution to the organization is my worst rating. I never understood that. And that misalignment can be extremely painful for the individual, but for the company, I left. So when you look at it, I put a lot of question mark there, is having to find that magical balance. Does your organization operate on a consistent set of metrics? Does your organization have a consistent set of key performance indicators? I recently asked that to another one of my clients, and the answer is no, we don't. We don't even have it, actually. We only have it at some departmental level, but it doesn't roll up. Do the metrics give you the ability to diagnose and predict? Predictive powers, so in other words, give you an indicator a little bit into the future of how well you're likely to perform 3 months downstream. What is that visibility? Are people and team rewarded for the right results and behaviors? Organizations should critically challenge their current metrics and make sure they measure the desired outcome. Larry Bossidy, in his book, The Discipline of Getting Things Done, he pointed out that reward system, and Honeywell was very big on making sure they have the right reward system for their employees. It is pivotal to motivating people. So I thought that was important. And then scoreboard. I think there are some very, very good scoreboards out there. We didn't put any of them here, but a couple of things that you can see. I think traffic sign is one of the best scoreboard. It's universally adopted, pretty much all over the world. Some countries may have 4 colors, not necessarily always 3, but 3 is the most common one that I have seen. And immediately when people see red, you know it's stop. Right? That's a classic scoreboard. We adopt that in project management. And if people remember, Homeland Security before had a 5-color system, that was creating a bit of chaos. Right? I think they got rid of the color system altogether now. The other great scoreboards that people tend to intuitively understand are any type of point system, soccer, should say basketball, not basket, football, etc. There are also goalposts, revenues, profit goals, profit margin, market share. I often love United Way's, for donation. This is our goal, this is where we are, sort of a temperature thermometer. That works very nice. If you want the change to be executable by a massive number of people in your organization, especially in the M&A case in my example, the client, coming up with the right scoreboard that people can align their projects and understood when they're making progress is paramount, because the momentum, positive momentum builds on each other. And then lastly is develop a culture of accountability. This is a very, very tough topic to achieve in organization if it didn't already have a culture of accountability. And what does that mean is that people, it is not okay to let that date slip, scope creep. People have to be committed toward the goal of the enterprise. But it's hard to instill that using, especially undertaking large initiatives. This is when organizations have to be rather pragmatic and realistic about their organization capabilities. In his book, Larry Bossidy, he talked about when he started taking over the Honeywell, he instituted a quality circle project. Relatively easy to do. People can see the objectives before they take on Six Sigma. In the client organization, we advocate. Let's put in together simple metrics, putting together a framework for managing projects, in which now you have a baseline of dates, schedule, cost, resources, and you now start measuring people against that and start helping them to achieve those goals. You start small, because once you start building that winning mentality and able to accomplish the smaller things, the organization is now prepared to take on larger initiatives. So that rhythm of accomplishment has to be established. And I think the fifth factor in our 5 rules is the hardest to do. Because finding what's the right level of challenge for the organization at any one time is not an easy task. And this is when the leaders also have to be flexible. And I think, but if you do that well, you build the right cadence of accountability, then organization will become strengthened over time and able to take on larger initiatives. So that's our 5th rule. Okay, I think I've done enough talking. I'm glad only, how many people fell asleep? Show of hand. Of course, the person who fell asleep couldn't show their hands, so nobody fell asleep. That's great. Any questions? We're pretty much done.
On that note, how do you feel about agile process?
Oh, I love agile process as long as I don't have to use it. No, I'm kidding. Agile processes, I believe, and PMI is very big on agile because recently we even came out with a certification on agile project management, right? Agile project management or agile processes has a very, very broad spectrum, just to lay out the work. On the extreme end, you have extreme programming. And on the other side, which is actually quite close to waterfall, you have DSDM, Dynamic System Development Methodology. And if you look at DSDM, DSDM is somewhat like waterfall, except it has a little bit more iteration in it with more rapid development. On the extreme side, of course, extreme programming is you essentially skip the requirement and you program. Right? The idea of extreme programming is in a complicated system, typically users cannot give you the right level of requirements. They just simply don't know. They haven't seen it, they haven't touched it. So you can't rely on users or customers to give you the requirements. Might as well get something done in a prototype fashion that you can touch, feel, adjust, and use. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you didn't spend that much time on it, so no pain. So Agile is, in my view, especially on the more toward the extreme side, is great toward, let's say, feature-rich, incremental change that you need to interact with a lot of people. And also that those changes are sufficiently innovative that the people don't really have a lot of strong requirements sort of off the gate. But Agile doesn't work when you're talking about a massive change that needs to get to at least the phase 1 to be something that's fairly operational. So for example, take ERP systems, SAP system. I just can't imagine an organization do a ERP implementation in that extreme agile way. Now you could do it in the DSDM way, but not in that extreme agile way. It's just because the first round of whatever you plan for that phase has to be something substantial. You know, there's no really such thing as partially replace the general ledger. You may replacing one department, not the other, but then you have to have another effort to try to synchronize the two. So that's my view. I think it has a lot of places. I think it has a lot of great concepts. I do think that a lot of practitioners use it as an excuse for lack of planning and management. And that is the danger of Agile.
And like you mentioned, it is bigger or broader.
Yes. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Dave, for a really nice, comprehensive overview of the many facets of success on business strategy. I have one that's a very practical matter. I spend a lot of time in my job dealing with contracts and especially SLAs. Mm-hmm. And I abide your notion that you want to have this element of good enough in the mix to succeed. How do you reconcile good enough when you're talking contract, deliverable, and SLA? Because your lawyers are usually reading these things, and good enough is never good enough.
That's a great question. I'm not sure if there is a good academic answer I could give. Because it comes down to how much you could afford. right? Especially working with vendors on SLA, frankly, the more you pay them, the more higher quality they're willing to extend to you. But I think a couple of the practicality elements that constrain the discussion around SLA is, what is the budget? What is the criticality of what you're trying to set up? For example, if you're financial services and you're trading, huge volume of stocks and bonds and everything else, that real-time transaction is critical. You have literally nanoseconds before the error can be detected and shut down.
Yeah,
Right.
I actually get all that. The thing I'm really driving at is, are you in touch with any intelligence and language or practice that actually articulates the good enough strategy in a way that's digestible to everybody who is looking at a program and saying, I get it, we're achieving our business excellence, and we're doing it by embracing good enough to say, this is our key priority, here only excellence is good enough. But the other, I'm really looking for the templates, because this language is very hard to sell.
It is very hard to sell, and I say that in all sincerity. We even talked about in our company, how do we promote this idea of good enough and go to our client, and we essentially don't, because there's no book out there. There's In Search of Excellence. There is no book titled In Search of Good Enough.
Yes, in search of almost there.
Yeah, in search of imperfection, but good enough to work. I can't imagine writing that title. So I don't have an easy answer to your question. I do think is the legitimacy side is important, to have the business buy-in or the organization you work with, and people commonly agree to a set of metrics. And that set of metrics has to be reasonable in terms of the funding and the other constraints that you're confronting.
So I have, I'm sorry to...
No, that's a good question.
I have an idea for your good ideas list.
Okay.
A place where we might be able to deal with that issue is in the methodology of conjoint analysis of a project. Because conjoint analysis really does boil down to, in design, trade-offs.
Yes, that's absolutely true. There's actually a good book. And I didn't put it up here because it didn't deal with business execution heads-on, but it's a book, the title is The Go. And it talked about the dynamic between the global optimization versus a local optimization. And this is especially true in organization when you are redesigning, this is talking about re-engineering effort of your organizational processes. You want to optimize globally across the wide spectrum of processes you have. You may very well sacrifice certain local areas and make it even more inefficient than before because you're dumping all the inefficiencies into certain areas. So there's a great book called The Go on that. Thank you. Yeah, The Go. It's a 1980-some book, and I think Chichong read it. Yeah. When you listen on audio tape, sometimes you want your drive to be a little longer. That's when you know it's a good book. You hit your destination, sitting in your car, listening, okay, good. Thank God, let's go. Any other questions?
Yes, I had a question.
Yes.
Earlier today we were talking about sustainability.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, in all these processes, where do you either implement it or at least try to bring the focus of the other members?
The sustainability. Well, I think the sustainability is a key theme. And it's especially when you look at the competencies, both at the competencies level, thinking about green and sustainability, as well as at the practical side of the disciplines, right? Take project management. There's a significant movement in our industry today that's talking about green project management. That is about thinking that when you start planning out a project, and this is not about stop printing your project plan on pieces of paper. This is about applying the sustainable concepts to everything you do. Whether the project is, let's say, a data center move, well, what is the new data center? How green is the new data center? If it's construction. So it occurs, I think, at a more detailed level in each of those either competency areas or the discipline areas. It has to be embedded in there. I personally like to buy Subaru. Why? Because they claim to have almost zero landfill. And that sustainability is built into how they design and manufacture the vehicle. So, good question. Anybody else?
Now, I know early on in the presentation you had mentioned how the PMP went from a distinct competitive advantage to almost parity within the industry. Is there something from a certification perspective that would, I guess, lead to the, a new type of competitive advantage amongst the PMP, like something that's more specialized?
Absolutely. At least in the world PMI, Project Management Institute, there are 5 major certifications, maybe 7. But the biggest one is PMP, Project Management Professional. The Agile one, PMACH, is the one that just came out. Then there's the Program Management Professional, PGMP. PGMP is rather distinct. It's very hard to obtain. It's very rigorous. And it's also very expensive. But if you attain that, right now there's less than 950 PGMPs in the world at this current point. So when I go to New York meeting, for example, this past week, there were actually new PGMP there. He and I are the only 2 PGMPs in the room. And most often, I'm the only one who is PGMP. It is a very distinctive certification. I'm not sure how widely applicable it is, though, or recognizable. And so, having said that, most people don't know PGMP, but it does definitely give you a badge of honor, and it is a differentiator. But I would say also explore outside of the world of Project Management Institute. You know, I may be the director of outreach, but there are many, many great programs out there. ITEL, for example. ITEL has a whole list of various certification. And I would say for anybody who especially work in the information technology space, look at ITEL. I think ITEL will be more greatly adopted in the near future because their library of standards is a very elegant thing. It is quite beautiful. Good question. Anybody else? Brian.
Yeah. How might you typically assess the values, behaviors, attitude, core competencies of an organization to help determine your readiness to execute a large-scale project?
It's actually quite simple. You call a meeting, do people show up on time? When you go attend a meeting, are there meeting agendas? Are anybody taking meeting notes? How are decisions made? And when you leave the meeting, are there a set of action items? And if there are decisions that needs to be made by somebody, how likely are they able to adhere to whatever date they commit to? For that matter, whether they even could come up with a date. So you could almost quickly, it doesn't take very much to understand and to sense how execution ready the organization is. In some ways, execution readiness, you know when you have it. It's very, very hard to describe, right? You know when you work with, for example, I interview a lot of project managers. You know that person is a solid project manager. Why? They came prepared, they came on time, they came slightly ahead, they asked the right questions. You ask them for certain materials to bring, they bring all the things that you ask for. You know that person's diligent. So at that individual level, that person is a strong professional who's likely able to get things done. That's the same thing true for an organization. You ask them, or it takes a couple questions to know if an organization is really good at execution. Right? Just go to their meetings and see what happens. Are people sitting comfortably? Are people sort of alert and ready to participate? That immediately tells you the culture of the organization. When people come in, the person who runs the meeting, is there a meeting agenda? Is there a specific set of objectives? And if there is not, why are we meeting? And if the meetings are conducting the meetings, there are action items, are there people volunteering to take the action items, especially the right people who's responsible for that area? And if you see everybody's yielding or pushing back or doing politics, that's probably not great execution. So no, it doesn't take a lot. Excellent question. Anybody else? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I want to thank everybody. So that's the question. This deck, which I'd be happy to share with everybody, please sign in. And if you have your email address and you say, yes, I'll send it to you. In the appendix, we did put in the other 60, there's 69 competencies in total. Don't read this, you'll get a headache. But I could send that to you. And the reference mentioned here are also listed, as well as all the books that we looked at. So Again, thank you very much for your time on a Saturday morning or now afternoon. So thank you for joining us.